Wyoming Territory, September 1887, Olive Sutton stood barefoot on the warped porch boards of the only home she had ever known, her hands tight around the frayed hem of her apron. The early morning wind pushed through the cottonwoods, carrying the dry rustle of dying leaves and the low creak of wagon wheels. Sheriff Danner's boots hit the dirt with purpose, and behind him, two ranch hands waited with a wagon meant to carry her away. "You have until sunup to gather your things," the sheriff said, voice low, not unkind but firm. "The rent's 6 months past due, Olive. The bank owns this land now." She nodded once, eyes burning but dry. She had cried all she could the night before. There was nothing left but silence. She turned and stepped inside the house, where sunlight slipped through the cracks in the shutters, touching the only two belongings she had not packed: her mother's Bible and the sketch her daughter, Sophie, had drawn before she died last winter. The floorboards creaked behind her. "Olive," she turned, startled. The man standing in her doorway was tall, dusty from the trail, with a sun-worn hat in one hand and a paper folded in the other. His voice struck something in her, steady, familiar, a sound from years ago. "Gideon Thorne," he said, offering a hesitant smile. "You probably do not remember me," she blinked. "You were friends with my brother. You worked here one summer fixing fence lines." He nodded. "I was 19, you were 14. You used to throw apples at me from the orchard." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "You always deserved it." That made him laugh, and it filled the room in a strange and aching way. But the sound faded quick, and her eyes drifted back toward her satchel near the door. "I reckon you heard," she said. "I did." Gideon glanced toward the porch. "Saw the wagon on the road when I rode in." Olive turned away, folding Sophie's drawing with care and tucking it into the Bible. "I tried to pay. I took in sewing, cleaned rooms, even helped with births out near Rawlins. But there's only so much a woman alone can do." Gideon stepped forward, holding out the paper. "I bought the house from the bank this morning." She blinked. "You, what?" "I paid the debt. The land, the house, it is all yours again. You do not owe another cent." Her breath caught. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her, quiet and steady. "Because you should not have to leave your home, and because I want you to stay." The sheriff's boots echoed on the porch again. "Everything all right in there?" Gideon opened the door and held up the deed. "No need for that wagon, Sheriff. This property has a new owner." The sheriff looked from Gideon to Olive, then grunted. "Well, all right then." The wagon creaked away. The dust settled. Inside, Olive stared at Gideon, her hands trembling. "You do not even know me." "I remember more than you think," he said, "and I have not stopped thinking about you since I left that summer." She turned away, overwhelmed. The last year had hollowed her. She had buried her daughter in February. Her husband had left 2 years before that, chasing gold in Colorado and never returning. She had not expected kindness, especially not from someone like Gideon Thorne. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "Then do not say anything," he said gently. "Just stay." She looked at him, really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper now, his shoulders broader, his hands rough from years of work. But there was something soft in him still, something she remembered from long ago. He had been a good boy. He had become a good man. "I have not cooked for anyone in months," she said suddenly. "And there is not much left in the cupboards, but if you are hungry I can make coffee, maybe some cornbread." He smiled. "I would like that." They sat on the porch steps with chipped mugs in their hands, the sun climbing slow above the cottonwoods. She asked him about his years on the trail, the cattle drives, the winters he spent working timber in Montana. He asked about Sophie, and she told him softly, carefully, about the fever, the long nights, the quiet. He did not look away. He listened. More than an hour passed before she realized her shoulders had eased and her heart was not pounding like it had been all morning. "She would have liked you," Olive said. "Sophie, she was full of questions. You would have answered every one." "I wish I had met her," he said, his voice low. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Gideon stood and stepped off the porch. "I will stable my horse and come back after I clean up, maybe split some wood, fix the front gate." She followed him to the edge of the steps. "You do not have to do all that." "I want to." He met her eyes, and something passed between them, unfinished but promising. It was not love yet. Not quite, but it was something strong enough to hold on to. As he walked toward the barn, Olive leaned against the porch post, her hand pressed to her chest. For the first time in over a year, she felt the smallest stir of hope. Maybe it was not the end of her story after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe that she might not be alone forever. The next morning came with a hard frost, the kind that clung to fence rails and turned the pump handle slick and silver. Olive stepped out into the yard with her shawl gathered close, the hem of her skirt brushing brittle grass. The quiet was different now, not hollow, like it had been, but full of subtle things. The scrape of a hatchet splitting wood, the low murmur of Gideon's voice as he spoke to the mule tethered near the barn, the soft clatter of feed poured into a trough. She found him kneeling by the chicken coop, hammer in hand, repairing a slat that had come loose in last week's wind. His coat was slung over a fence post, and a line of sweat darkened the back of his shirt despite the cold. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept working, slow and sure. "You always fix things without being asked?" she asked. He sat back on his heels and wiped his hand on his trouser leg, "Only when they're worth fixing." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and held out a folded scrap of cloth. "I made you something." "It's not much." He took it carefully. It was a kerchief, hand-stitched, the edges hemmed with even thread. There was a small G embroidered in one corner, crooked but deliberate. "I haven't sewn for anyone since." She stopped, then looked past him at the bluff rising beyond the pasture. "Since a long time ago." He ran a thumb over the stitches. "I'll wear it under my collar, keep the wind off." She nodded once, then turned toward the house. "Breakfast'll be ready in a bit, if you don't mind cornbread again." "I don't mind anything you make," he said quietly. Inside, she stirred cornmeal over the stove, watching the steam curl through the air. The warmth reached her hands, but not her thoughts. She was still trying to understand what Gideon wanted, not just today, but tomorrow and all the days after. He had come back into her life with quiet steadiness, no explanation but his presence. When he came in, he brought the cold with him, his boots leaving damp prints across the floor. He didn't sit right away, just stood near the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I filed the deed under your name," he said. "I signed it over at the land office this morning before you woke." She turned from the stove, startled. "Why would you do that?" "You said this was your home," he said. "I just made sure it stays that way." She set the wooden spoon down. "You're a stranger, Gideon. You think you remember me, but people change." "I know," he said. "I've changed too." He didn't come any closer, just looked at her like he was waiting for her to see something in him. She did. It wasn't the boy who used to chase horses with her brother or grin when she threw apples. It was a man who'd seen too much and carried it quietly. "I don't trust easy anymore," she said. "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'm just asking you to let me stay long enough to earn it." She looked at him a long time, then turned back to the stove. "Then you'd better sit. Cornbread's burning." They ate in silence for a while. The fire popped behind them, and the smell of coffee hung between their plates. After a few bites, she said, "What happened to your folks?" "Father died from a fall off a ladder," he said. "Mother passed 2 winters later. I've been drifting since." "So why stop drifting now?" He set down his fork. "Because I've been looking for something that lasts. I figured maybe it wasn't a place, maybe it was a person." Olive didn't answer. Her throat felt tight. Later, he offered to ride into town to pick up salt and lamp oil. She watched him saddle his horse from the window, the way he moved with quiet confidence, as if he belonged not just on the land, but near her. As he rode off, the wind picked up and rattled the shutters. She went to the cupboard and pulled down Sophie's old quilt, folding it slowly across the back of the settee. Her hands lingered on the fabric, then fell to her sides. She wasn't ready to name what was growing between them, but it was real and it was steady. And in the quiet of the house he had given back to her, she allowed herself for the first time to imagine a future that didn't end in silence. Gideon didn't return until the sun was low and the wind had shifted, coming down from the mountains with a sharper edge. Olive spotted him from the kitchen window, riding slow along the fence line, his hat pulled low, a parcel tied behind his saddle. She didn't go out to meet him. Instead, she finished straining the broth she'd been simmering since midday and set the table with the dishes she hadn't used since, before Sophie fell ill, the ones rimmed with blue glaze and tiny, faded flowers. He stepped inside, brushing dust from his sleeves. Hard riding out there. Trails soft from last week's rain near the edge of the canyon. Nearly lost a shoe. She nodded toward the basin. Water's hot if you want to wash up before supper. He washed without a word, then joined her at the table. The meal passed with the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. When they were both done, she gathered the plates, and he leaned back in his chair, watching her hands work. "I saw Tom Sutter in town," he said. "He asked after you." Her back stiffened slightly. "Tom Sutter never looked at me unless he needed something mended. He mentioned you helped his sister through a hard labor last spring. She was alone. I couldn't leave her." He nodded once. "Folks remember that sort of thing. Doesn't mean they come around," she said, drying her hands. "Not when things turn bad." Gideon stood and walked to the hearth where the fire had gone to coals. He picked up a split log and set it gently on the embers. "I didn't come here to stir up old wrongs." She folded the towel slowly. "Then why did you come, Gideon?" He hesitated, then turned. "I was in Laramie last winter, saw a man freeze to death with his back against a church wall. He had coin in his pocket, but no one knew his name. I thought if that's how I end up, I want to have at least tried to live right." She looked at him then, really looked at the way his shoulders held that weight, how his jaw tensed like he was bracing for her to turn him away. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to," he replied. "I just want to stay near, help where I can. If that's all, it's enough." She walked to the cupboard and pulled down a small tin. "I kept Sophie's seeds," she said. "Cornflower, sweet pea, some kind of squash she liked the name of. I thought I'd plant them come spring, didn't know if I'd even be here long enough." He stepped forward, taking the tin in his calloused hands. "We'll plant them together." Her fingers brushed his as she let go. She didn't pull away. "You're good with wood," she said. "Could build a trellis by the back fence. Morning sun hits it just right. I'll start tomorrow." She nodded and turned back to the hearth, banked the fire, and moved to the door. He followed, stepping out onto the porch beside her. The sky was a deep, cold blue, stars scattered sharp across it. The kind of night that made everything feel still. "My mother used to say the stars are quieter when you've got someone standing beside you," she said. He glanced at her. "You think she was right, I think," she said, folding her arms against the chill. "It's easier to believe that now." He didn't answer, just stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They stayed there until the cold crept through the wood and into their boots, until the silence between them felt less like absence and more like promise. When she turned to go back in, he followed without needing to be asked. By late October, the days had shortened, and the wind came off the hills with the smell of snow. The trees along the creek had dropped their last yellow leaves, leaving the branches dark and bare against the pale sky. Gideon had built a lean-to against the barn for firewood, and Olive had started drying herbs by the stove, tying bunches of sage and yarrow with rough twine. That evening, she sat at the table sorting beans into a tin basin, her fingers moving slow from the ache in her knuckles. Gideon came in through the back, his coat dusted with wood shavings, carrying a small box made from pine. "I finished it," he said, setting it down between them. She ran her hand over the smooth lid. "What's it for?" "Sophie's drawings. You said you kept them tucked in the Bible." "Thought they deserved their own place." She opened the lid. The inside was lined with soft muslin, stitched neatly along the corners. Her throat tightened. "You built this," he nodded. She closed it gently. "It's beautiful." He didn't say anything, just pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The oil lamp flickered between them, throwing soft shadows across the wood. "I saw a man outside the mercantile asking for work," he said after a pause. "Younger than me. Looked like he hadn't eaten in 2 days." Olive shifted a few beans into the bowl. "Did you talk to him?" "I offered him a job digging post holes," Gideon said. He had the look of someone who'd never held a shovel, but he said yes quick. She glanced up. "You planning to build more fence?" "No," he said, "but he needed the coin. I figured I could find something worth paying him for." She studied his face. "You always like that, taking in strays." I don't see people as strays, he said. Just folks needing a hand until they can stand on their own. She leaned back slightly. You think that's what I am? He met her eyes. No, I think you're already standing. I just wanted to be beside you when you did. They sat without speaking for a while, the only sound the wind brushing against the shutters. Then Olive reached under the table and pulled out a folded square of cloth. I found this in the attic, she said. It's a quilt top my mother pieced years ago, never got around to finishing it. Gideon unfolded it carefully. The fabric was faded but strong, stitched in a pattern of stars and squares. You want to finish it? I thought about it, she said. It'd be good to have something warm come winter. I'll help if you show me what to do, she smiled, surprised. You ever held a needle? Not unless I was bleeding. That made her laugh, soft and sudden. He smiled at that, and the moment settled between them like something clear and certain. You reckon we'll have an early snow? She asked, gathering the beans into the sack. Sky's been heavy all day, he said. If it comes, we'll be ready. She tied off the sack and stood. He followed her to the hearth where the fire had burned low. She added a log and watched the flames lick up around it. Gideon, she said, not turning, do you miss the trail? He stepped closer. Sometimes, the quiet, the sky so wide you forget where it ends, but there's something about waking up in the same place. Knowing who's waiting at the table, she turned then, slowly. I never thought I'd want to settle again, not after everything. I'm not asking you to promise anything, he said, just to let me stay near as long as it's welcome. She reached for his hand. Her fingers were cold, but he didn't pull away. His hand closed around hers, firm and warm. It is, she said. It is welcome. They stood there, the fire casting long shadows across the floor, the wind slipping down from the ridgeline. Outside, the first snow began to fall, silent and slow, covering the ground in a soft hush. Inside, the quiet held them gently, not as something empty, but as something full, something beginning. The snow deepened by early December, laying thick over the pasture and softening the world into shades of white and gray. The days passed in steady rhythm, feeding stock, tending hearths, mending what needed mending. Gideon built a hand sled to haul water barrels from the creek when the pump froze, and Olive began preserving what root vegetables she had left, storing them in the cellar against the long stretch of winter ahead. That morning, the sun rose late and low, casting a pale glow across the fields. Olive stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of chicory brew, watching the mule paw at the snow near the fence. Behind her, Gideon came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots. 2 of the hens froze, he said, pulling off his gloves. I moved the rest into the shed where the winds blocked, she turned. We'll need to sew heavier covers for their roost. I was thinking the same. He hung his coat and crossed to the stove, rubbing his hands near the warmth. There's a man in town selling wool scraps cheap, says his wife's been sewing for the army. I could ride in and see what's left, she nodded. Pick up more flour, too. I'm making winter biscuits for the neighbors come St. Stephen's Day. He glanced over. You planning to give them all away? Not all, she said. Just enough to remind folks we're still here. He stepped closer, his voice quieter. You ever think about what here might look like come spring? She looked up at him, her breath catching a little. I've been thinking, he said, about building a second room onto the back of the house. One with a stove of its own. Could be for sewing or for quiet if quiet's ever needed. Her voice was low. You building it for me? I'm building it because I want this place to be ours. They stood close, the air between them warm from the stove but warmer still from the quiet truth in his words. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his chest. I never thought I'd have ours again, she said. He covered her hand with his. You do now. That night she brought out the quilt pieces and laid them across the table. The fire was steady, the windows fogged from heat and snow. He joined her with needle and thread, clumsy at first but learning. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The softness of the moment held more than words could. In the days that followed, they worked side by side. He patched the roof above the lean-to. She bottled the last of the apple preserves. When a neighbor's child fell ill, Olive rode out with a satchel of willow bark and a calm hand. When she returned, wind-bitten and weary, Gideon met her at the door with hot broth and silence that said everything. Near the end of the month, he brought a small cedar box in from the barn. Inside was a braid of horsehair, looped with silver wire. "I had this made for you," he said, holding it out. "It was my mother's idea once. She said a woman should wear something made by the hands of a man who knows her strength." Olive ran her thumb over the smooth braid, eyes stinging. "I'll wear it when I go to town," she said. "Let them see what you've given me." He stepped closer. "It's not the only thing I want to give." She looked up. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "Not because it's owed or expected, because I want to wake beside you every morning and know we're building something that lasts." She didn't answer right away. She stepped forward, took his hand, and placed the braid carefully inside the cedar box again. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that very much." They were married in February in the little chapel 3 miles down the road. The preacher brought his wife to witness, and Olive wore a dress she'd sewn from dark blue calico with a white collar stitched by candlelight. Gideon wore his Sunday best and carried a sprig of winterberry in his coat pocket. They spent that night in the house they had made into a home, snow falling silent again outside the windows. He built the second room in the spring, just as he promised, and she filled it with Sophie's drawings and the quilt they finished together. Together, they planted the cornflowers and sweet peas along the fence. The squash vines took slowly, but Gideon built them a frame and steadied each one with twine. Olive watched them bloom, her hand resting on her belly, where new life stirred beneath her apron. The house filled, not just with warmth and work, but with music's soft fiddle notes when he played by firelight, laughter when neighbors came by with pie or seed. And inside it all, two people who had once known only loss found a quiet, steady joy. No fire burned too hot. No silence lingered too long. And every morning they rose in the same place, hearts sure, hands joined, the road ahead theirs to walk together.